We're in Southampton today to visit the memorials to the passengers and crew of the Titanic. We'll also visit some of the places which have an association with the ship. We'll be starting at the top of the city and ending up down at the dockside. To remind us then, the Titanic set sail from Southampton on her maiden voyage on the 10th of April 1912. She called in at Cherbourg and at Queenstown in Southern Ireland, and then headed off across the Atlantic towards New York. The RMS Titanic, to give the ship its official name, was built in Belfast and was to be the flagship of the White Star Line, which was based here in Southampton. At that time, the cruise liners were the only way to cross the Atlantic. In 1912, commercial flights across the Atlantic were another 27 years in the future. There were 2,435 passengers and 908 crew on board. Over 1,500 of those lost their lives when the Titanic hit an iceberg in the middle of the Atlantic. This included 685 members of the crew. Almost all of the crew lived in Southampton, so the city was devastated when the news of the sinking came through. The first memorial that we'll see is on the City Ring Road and is outside of a solicitor's office. It's one of the smallest memorials, but it commemorates one of the best known acts during the sinking of the ship. This is the memorial to the band, who famously continued to play on as the ship sank to keep up people's spirits. The band members were all men, and of course it was women and children first to get on the lifeboats. Sadly, all the brave band members perished. A month after the tragedy, the Albert Hall was packed to capacity for the memorial concert remembering the members of the band. The next memorial that we'll find is just across the road, and it's a much grander affair. This is probably the most famous of the Titanic memorials, the Titanic Engineers Memorial. Built of granite and bronze, this was erected in 1914. It pays tribute to the men who kept the ship's power going until the final moments before the plunge into the icy waters of the Atlantic. We'll walk across the park now, past the War Memorial, and over to the Civic Centre. We'll go round the side of the building to the museum. This is an excellent interactive experience. I'm just going to show you a few images from the exhibition. This is a section of the wall showing all of the crew members. The ones in red lived in Southampton. This is a mock-up of a section of one of the boiler rooms. Imagine how hot it would be working there, stoking the boilers. This is a street map of Southampton at the time of the Titanic. Every red dot shows where a dead crew member lived. Imagine the grief of the people who lived here when the RMS Titanic sank in April 1912 with the loss of 685 crew members, most of whom lived in these streets. The museum includes an excellent recreation of the inquiry which took place into the disaster. At least, lessons were learned. There's another memorial to see here at the Civic Centre. Behind the door in front of us is the memorial to the postal workers on board the Titanic who died trying to save the mail. The RMS that comes before Titanic's name stands for Royal Mail Ship. Remember, there were no transatlantic flights in 1912, so the liners were the fastest method to move mail between continents. Along with its passengers, the Titanic was contracted to carry 3,064 mail bags to New York. The plaque is made from bronze, which came from one of the Titanic's spare propellers. Nearby, we can see the Titanic Book of Remembrance, which commemorates the victims of the Titanic tragedy who lived in Southampton. This book, displayed on a marble plinth, was donated by the City of Southampton Society. The rest of our walk takes place in the Old City area and the docks. This is the northern gate into the Old City. We're heading now for Holyrood Church. The church was destroyed during the bombing of the city in 1940 during the Second World War. It was never rebuilt, but the ruins were made safe, and it's now a memorial to Southampton's merchant seamen. A fitting place then to find the Titanic Memorial, which is dedicated to the firemen, stewards and crew from Southampton. It was paid for by the families and friends of the crew. It was originally intended to be a commemorative drinking fountain, until the Memorial Committee realised that might not be appropriate. There are various memorials throughout the church. It's a very calm and serene space in the middle of the city. A couple of streets away we come to St Joseph's Church. Inside the church is the Gatti Memorial. This is an oak table which has a plaque in memory of the restaurant workers who lost their lives, including Luigi Gatti, who was responsible for the restaurants on board the ship. There was a service going on when I visited, so I wasn't able to see the table itself. We're now in Oxford Street, close to the docks. It's now a road of bars and restaurants. Some of the pubs that were here in 1912 are still here, amongst them being The Grapes. Three brothers, Bertram, Tom and Alfred Slade, were members of Titanic's crew. They spent slightly too long enjoying themselves in the Grapes before the Titanic sailed, and they were too late to board the ship. Imagine how they felt when news of the sinking came through. As we continue down Oxford Street, we come to another Titanic-related pub, the White Star. A little further along Oxford Street we come to the former Sailors' Home. This building opened as a sailors' home in 1909 to provide temporary accommodation for seamen whilst they were in port. Several of the Titanic crew stayed here prior to sailing, and the majority of these perished. At the bottom of Oxford Street we can see a casino. In 1912 this was the Southampton Terminus rail station, the place where many of Titanic's passengers would have arrived in Southampton. Almost next door, the building in front of us is South Western House. This was an Edwardian luxury hotel where many of the first class passengers would have stayed before boarding the Titanic. If we continue along the road, we'll come to Canute Chambers. In 1912 this was the local offices of the White Star Line. Following the sinking, this street was packed with relatives desperate to see if their loved ones had survived the tragedy. For days, the steps of Canute Chambers were besieged by hundreds of people eagerly awaiting any news that would trickle out. Sadly, most of them would be disappointed. Just along the road we come to the entrance to what was then berths 43 and 44, from where the Titanic set sail on the 10th of April 1912. There's a plaque here which commemorates the passengers who died. If you want to cross the Atlantic by ship today, you'll probably go on the Queen Mary 2. If you take this trip, you'll pass over, or very close to the place, where the Titanic hit the iceberg and sank. The captain will make an announcement, and when you look out across the expanse of grey sea, you can get just a small appreciation of how those poor Titanic passengers must have felt.